teacher thought he was going to humiliate the girl with the guitar. But when she starts, no one can believe it. Emily Parker held the guitar with trembling hands as Professor Richard Blackwell adjusted his glasses and smiled cruelly. It was the third day in a row he had called her to play in front of the entire class at the Boston Municipal Conservatory of Music, and she knew it was no coincidence. "Go ahead, Miss Parker," said the professor, slapping his hand on the desk. "Show your classmates how to play the exercise we went over yesterday. I'm sure you practiced hard at home." The sarcasm in his voice was obvious. Emily glanced at the curious faces of the other students in the auditorium. Some seemed to pity her, while others were just waiting for the humiliation show Professor Richard had turned into a routine. The 17-year-old swallowed hard and positioned her fingers on the guitar's neck. What Professor Richard didn't know was that Emily had spent the entire night practicing, not just the simple exercise he had assigned, but a far more complex piece she had been secretly studying for months. Her calloused fingers were proof of the countless hours she spent playing, even when everyone thought she was just a poor girl with no musical talent. "I'm waiting," the professor muttered, crossing his arms over his wrinkled brown suit. Emily took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes came out a little shaky, just as Professor Richard expected. He was already opening his mouth to make one of his venomous remarks when something changed. The notes grew steadier, more precise, and suddenly she wasn't playing the simple exercise he had assigned anymore. The melody coming from the guitar was complex, captivating, full of nuances few students at the conservatory could master. The murmurs in the audience died completely. Professor Richard felt a strange sensation in his stomach and adjusted his glasses again, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Emily closed her eyes and lost herself in the music. It was an adaptation of American Suite No. 4 by Copland, a piece few professional guitarists dared to attempt. Her fingers danced across the strings with a precision only years of practice could bring. The girl everyone saw as just a simple girl from Dorchester was displaying talent that rivaled the best students the conservatory had ever seen. The professor felt his palms grow sweaty. For 3 months, ever since Emily had arrived at the conservatory, on a scholarship, he had made a point of humiliating her whenever he could. He thought a girl from the outskirts didn't belong there, studying alongside the children of Boston's elite. But now, listening to that flawless performance, he began to question everything he thought he knew about talent and social background. When Emily finished playing, the silence in the auditorium stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then one of the students started clapping, and soon the whole class was applauding. Professor Richard stood frozen, his hands on his head, trying to process what he had just witnessed. How did you learn that?" he asked, his voice coming out weaker than he intended. Emily opened her eyes and looked straight at him. For a moment, the professor saw something in her gaze that frightened him, pure determination and a maturity far beyond her 17 years. "I taught myself, Professor, on the nights you thought I was at home watching TV." The simple answer echoed through the auditorium like a slap in the face. Professor Richard felt his face grow hot and realized every eye was fixed on him, waiting for his reaction. In decades of teaching, he had been respected, even feared. Now a teenager had just shown that her prejudices were unfounded and that talent knew no social class. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now continuing. "Class dismissed for today," murmured the professor, gathering his papers with trembling hands. But Emily didn't move from her spot. She adjusted the guitar on her lap and looked at the professor, who was trying to escape the awkward situation. "Professor Richard, may I speak with you for a moment?" Her respectful yet firm tone made him stop halfway to the door. Slowly, he turned to face the young woman who had just turned his world upside down. "What do you want?" he asked, trying to regain some of his lost authority. "I want to understand why you take such pleasure in trying to humiliate me," said Emily, standing up and carefully placing her guitar in its case. "Did I do something to offend you?" Professor Richard felt a lump in his throat. How could he explain to a 17-year-old that his prejudices stemmed from decades of professional frustration? How could he tell her that he saw in her everything? He had never managed to be Talented, passionate, determined? You wouldn't understand, he muttered, avoiding her gaze. This place isn't for people like you. People like me? Emily took a step forward. Do you mean poor people? People who live in Dorchester? People whose parents aren't doctors or lawyers? Each word was like a needle pricking the professor's conscience. He knew he was being unfair, but he couldn't control the resentment he felt. At 55, Richard Blackwell had become a bitter teacher, frustrated that he had never become the musician he dreamed of being in his youth. "You know nothing about me," he said, his voice heavy with a sadness that surprised even himself. "Then tell me," Emily challenged, crossing her arms, "tell me why a music professor hates seeing a student play well so much." The professor stared at her for a long moment. There was something in the young woman's determined posture that reminded him of himself long ago, when he still believed he could conquer the world with his music. But that memory only deepened his bitterness. "Because you play better than I ever could," he confessed, the words coming out as a whisper, "and it makes me furious." The honest confession took Emily by surprise. She had expected more excuses, more arrogance, not this raw vulnerability in the professor's eyes. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Professor, you've had 40 years to become the musician you wanted to be," she said, slinging the guitar strap over her shoulder. "I'm only 17. If you spent all that time growing bitter instead of better, that's not my fault." The words hit Professor Richard like a punch to the gut. He opened and closed his mouth several times, searching for a response, but no words came. Emily watched him for a few more seconds before heading toward the door. "Oh, Professor," she said, pausing at the threshold. "Tomorrow, I'll play the entire suite. I hope you're prepared." With that, she left, leaving Professor Richard alone in the auditorium, wrestling with a whirlwind of emotions he hadn't felt in decades. That evening, Emily arrived home at the small house in Dorchester she shared with her mother, Susan Parker, a 42-year-old woman who worked as a cleaner in 3 different homes to make ends meet. Susan was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard her daughter come in. "How was school today, sweetheart?" she asked, not taking her eyes off the pan where she was sautéing vegetables for dinner. Emily hesitated for a moment. She had never told her mother about the constant humiliations she endured at the conservatory. Susan already worked so hard to support the two of them. She didn't need to worry about her daughter's problems too. "It was fine, Mom," she replied, carefully placing the guitar in the corner of the room. "Just another day of classes." Susan turned and gave her that look only mothers have, the one that sees right through any lie. "Emily Parker, tell me the truth. What's going on at that school?" The young woman sighed and sat at the small kitchen table. She knew she couldn't fool her mother for long. Susan may not have had much schooling, but she had sharp intuition when it came to her daughter. "It's Professor Richard, Mom. He doesn't like me," Emily confessed, fidgeting with her fingers. "Doesn't like you how?" Susan asked, now fully focused on her daughter. "He thinks I don't belong there. Says that place isn't for people like us." Susan's face tightened with suppressed anger. She had spent her childhood hearing the same thing, treated as inferior for being poor. The last thing she wanted was for her daughter to endure the same pain. "And what did you say to him?" she asked, drying her hands on her apron. "Today, I proved him wrong," Emily said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I played that Copland piece I've been practicing." "You should have seen his face, Mom." Susan sat beside her daughter and took her calloused hands in hers. "My dear, you have a special gift. Don't let anyone, especially a bitter teacher, make you forget that. That guitar your father left you wasn't for nothing." The mention of her father made Emily's heart ache. Michael Parker had walked out when she was just 8, claiming he couldn't handle the financial struggles anymore. Before leaving, he had given her his classical guitar, saying it was the only thing of value he owned. For 9 years, that instrument had been her constant companion, her refuge in hard times. "Sometimes I wonder if he'd be proud," Emily murmured, glancing at the guitar in the corner. "I'm sure he would be," Susan said, squeezing her hands. "But what matters now is that I'm proud, and you should be proud of yourself too." Next day, Emily arrived at the conservatory with renewed determination. She had spent the night thinking about her conversation with her mother and had made an important decision. She wouldn't let Professor Richard humiliate her anymore. If he wanted a fight, she was ready for battle. Professor Richard, meanwhile, had spent a sleepless night. Emily's words echoed in his mind like a relentless hammer. She was right, and it tormented him. He had wasted decades wallowing in self-pity instead of improving. But admitting that would mean accepting his whole life had been a mistake. When Emily entered the classroom, the professor pretended not to notice her. She took her usual seat. In the front row, set her guitar beside her and waited. She knew he'd call on her to play. It was inevitable. "Today we'll work on advanced finger-picking techniques," the professor announced, his voice strained and unnatural. "I need a volunteer to demonstrate." No hands went up. Everyone knew volunteering in Professor Richard's class meant public humiliation. He let the silence linger before fixing his gaze on Emily. "Miss Parker, come up front." This time Emily stood without hesitation. She picked up her guitar and walked to the front of the room with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The professor watched her position herself and felt an unexpected pang of nervousness. "I want you to play the exercise on page 42, he said, opening the textbook to a specific page. Emily looked at the sheet music and nearly smiled. It was an intermediate exercise, much simpler than the piece she had played the day before. The professor was trying to regain control of the situation by choosing something he thought she wouldn't master. "Professor, may I suggest something more?" "Challenging?" she asked, adjusting the guitar on her lap. "You'll play what I told you to," he retorted, his voice taking on an authoritative tone. "Of course," Emily agreed. "But may I play it my way?" The professor hesitated. There was something in her tone that made him uncomfortable, as if she knew something he didn't. "Play it exactly as written in the book," he insisted. Emily nodded and began to play. The first notes were precisely as written, technical and correct. But then she started adding subtle variations, ornaments that weren't on the page, transforming the simple exercise into a work of art. It was as if she were taking a basic sketch and painting over it with vibrant colors. The other students leaned forward in their chairs, fascinated by the transformation unfolding before them. The exercise they all knew as monotonous and technical had become an engaging, almost hypnotic melody. Professor Richard felt his blood boil. She was doing exactly what he'd asked, but in a way that highlighted the mediocrity of the teaching material he used. It was a subtle yet devastating critique of his teaching method. "Stop," he said abruptly. Emily stopped playing mid-phrase, leaving the melody hanging uncomfortably in the air. "That's not what's written in the book," he accused. "No, Professor. It's what's written in the book plus my interpretation," she replied calmly. "I thought that's what music should be, technique plus soul." The response was a direct blow to the professor's ego. Throughout his career, he had focused solely on pure technique, ignoring the emotional aspects of music. That was why he'd never become the artist he dreamed of being. His performances were technically correct, but devoid of emotion. "Music isn't about showing off," he countered, trying to regain authority. "It's about discipline and respecting the rules." "With all due respect, Professor," Emily said, rising from her chair, "you're wrong." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. No one had ever challenged Professor Richard so directly. He stood speechless, unsure how to react to the insubordination. "Music is about communication," Emily continued. "It's about touching people's hearts, not just following rules on paper. If it were only about technique, any computer could do better than us." "Get out of my classroom," the professor said, his voice trembling with anger. "No," Emily replied simply. The no echoed through the room like thunder. The other students held their breath, waiting for the professor's outburst. But Professor Richard was so shocked he couldn't form words. "I pay to be here," Emily went on. "Well, my scholarship pays for me to be here, and I'll stay until the end of class, learning everything I can. But I won't accept being humiliated anymore just because you have personal issues with your own talent." The brutal honesty of her words left the professor speechless. She had put her finger on the wound with surgical precision. All his biases, all his bitterness, stemmed from the frustration of never becoming the musician he dreamed of being. And now a teenager was exposing that truth in front of the entire class. "You can't speak to me like that," he muttered, but without conviction. "Why not?" asked Emily. "You talk to me like this every day. The difference is now I'm talking back." Professor Richard Blackwell looked around the room and saw all the students' eyes fixed on him. Some seemed to be holding back laughter. Others looked impressed by Emily's courage. Everyone seemed to be waiting for his reaction. He felt like an actor on stage who had forgotten his lines. "Keep playing," he finally murmured, walking back to his desk with unsteady steps. Emily smiled slightly and sat back down. She knew she had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Professor Blackwell wasn't the type to accept defeat easily, and she was sure he'd try to retaliate somehow. For the rest of the class, the professor made a point of ignoring Emily completely. He called on other students to play, asked questions to the class, explained theoretical concepts, but acted as if she didn't even exist. It was a subtle form of retaliation, but Emily didn't mind. She used the time to observe the other students and analyze their techniques. When class ended, she was one of the last to leave. Professor Blackwell was organizing his papers when she approached his desk. "Professor, may I ask you something?" He looked up reluctantly. "What do you want now? Why did you choose to be a teacher instead of pursuing a career as a musician?" The question was simple, but it hit the professor like a knife. No one had ever asked him that so directly. For a moment he considered not answering, but there was something in Emily's eyes that made him change his mind. It was genuine curiosity, not malice. "Because I wasn't good enough," he answered, his voice quieter than he intended. "Or because you never had the courage to really try," Emily suggested gently. The professor stared at her, with a mix of anger and surprise. How could a 17-year-old girl have such insight into his life? "You know nothing about my life," he said, but without his usual sharpness. "I know you still have time to change," she replied. "I know it's never too late to chase a dream, even if it's different from what we imagined when we were young." "And why do you care?" he asked, genuinely confused. Emily thought for a moment before answering. "Because you're a good teacher when you're not trying to crush your students' confidence. And because I think music lost an artist when you gave up trying." The words caught Professor Blackwell completely off guard. He expected more confrontation, more defiance, not this unexpected show of compassion. For a moment his eyes stung and he had to look away. "Why are you being kind to me after everything I've done?" he asked, his voice wavering. "Because holding on to bitterness only hurts the one who holds it," said Emily. "And because I understand what it's like to be afraid of not being good enough." The professor looked up at her, truly seeing her for the first time since she'd arrived at the conservatory. She wasn't just a troublemaker or an intruder who needed to be put in her place. She was a young woman with extraordinary talent and wisdom far beyond her years. "I've been unfair to you," he finally admitted. "Yes," Emily agreed, "but that can change." "How?" "Start by actually teaching me instead of trying to humiliate me. And maybe, who knows, I might learn some of what you still have to teach." Professor Blackwell was silent for a long moment, processing the unexpected offer. For 3 months he had seen Emily as a threat, a painful reminder of his own failure. But now she was offering a truce, a chance to start over. "What if I can't change?" he asked. "What if I really am just a bad teacher?" "Then at least you'll have tried," replied Emily, "which is more than you can say for the past 40 years. The remark was sharp, but not cruel. It was the truth spoken with the brutal honesty only the young can muster. The professor felt something stir inside him, as if a long-locked door were being opened. "All right," he finally said. "Let's try." "Great," Emily smiled. "Can I start with a suggestion?" "What is it?" "How about you play for the class tomorrow? Show them why you decided to dedicate your life to music." Professor Richard's face paled. He hadn't performed in public for over 10 years, not since his last recital attempt had ended in humiliating disaster. I don't know if I can," he murmured. "Of course you can," Emily encouraged, "and if it helps, I can play with you a duet." The idea of performing alongside the student he'd tried to humiliate was surreal. But there was something intriguing about the proposal. It Had been so long since he'd felt any excitement about music. "What piece do you suggest?" he asked, surprising himself. "How about we let the music decide?" and Emily offered. "Let's improvise together. No sheet music, no rules, just music." The idea of improvising terrified the professor. His entire career had been built on controlled precision, strict adherence to scores. Improvising meant exposing himself, risking mistakes, showing vulnerability. "I don't know if I'm capable of that," he confessed. "Then let's find out together," Emily said, extending her hand. "What do you say?" Professor Richard looked at the young woman's outstretched hand and saw something he'd lost long ago: hope. Slowly, he reached out and clasped hers. "Let's try," he said, and for the first time in years, his smile was genuine. That night, Professor Richard returned home carrying a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. He lived alone in a small apartment in downtown Boston, surrounded by yellowed sheet music and theory books he hadn't opened in years. His routine had long been mechanical: wake up, teach, return home, watch TV, sleep. But today was different. For the first time in a decade, he took his guitar from the closet and tuned the strings. The instrument was dusty, neglected. But as he played the first notes, he felt something awaken inside him. It was like reuniting with an old friend after years of silence. He tried playing some of the pieces he'd once mastered in his youth, but his fingers were stiff, his technique weakened by years of disuse. Familiar frustration began to rise, but this time, he pushed through. Emily's words echoed in his mind. "It's never too late to chase a dream." Meanwhile, Emily was at home practicing too. But unlike the professor, she wasn't nervous, she was excited. For the first time since arriving at the conservatory, she felt she might find not just musical education, but a true mentor. Hassan watched her daughter play and noticed something different in her posture. "Did something good happen today?" she asked, sitting on the small living room couch. "I think Professor Richard and I reached an understanding," Emily replied, pausing her playing. "We're doing a performance together tomorrow." "A performance?" Susan raised an eyebrow. "With the professor who was humiliating you?" "It's complicated. Mom, I don't think he's really a bad person. He's just lost." Susan looked at her daughter with admiration. Even at 17, Emily displayed an emotional maturity many adults lacked. She'd learned early to look beyond appearances, to seek what drove people's behavior, rather than simply judging them. "Are you sure you want to do this?" asked Susan. "He might be planning something to humiliate you even more." "Could be," admitted Emily. "But if he is, at least I tried. And if he's not, maybe I helped someone rediscover their passion for music." "Where did you get so much wisdom, child?" asked Susan, shaking her head affectionately. "From Daddy's guitar," replied Emily, gently strumming the strings. "He may be gone, but he left more than an instrument. He left the music, and music taught me to listen not just to the notes, but also to the silence between them. And it's in the silence that we find people's true selves." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. The next day, news that Professor Richard and Emily would perform together spread through the conservatory like wildfire. Students entered the classroom with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Many thought it would just be another opportunity for the professor to publicly humiliate Emily. When Professor Richard walked in carrying his guitar, a murmur of surprise filled the room. No one knew he still played. For years, he had been only the strict teacher who criticized without showing his own skills. "Today, we'll have a different kind of lesson," he announced, his voice slightly shaky. "Miss Parker and I will demonstrate the importance of musical collaboration." Emily rose from her seat and walked to the front of the room, carrying her guitar with her usual confidence. But when she looked at the professor, she saw something unexpected: genuine fear in his eyes. "Professor," she whispered, stepping closer, "are you all right?" "I haven't played in public for over 10 years, he confessed quietly. "I don't know if I can do this." "Then don't think about the audience," Emily suggested. "Just think about the music. Imagine it's just us, two musicians, talking through our instruments." Professor Richard took a deep breath and nodded. He sat in the chair beside Emily and tuned his guitar with slightly trembling hands. When he finished, he looked at her for guidance. "Let's start with something simple," said Emily. "A basic chord progression. You can play the foundation and I'll improvise the melody over it." "All right," he agreed, positioning his fingers on the guitar. The professor began, playing a simple sequence of C major chords. His fingers were rusty, but the progression was clean and steady. Emily listened for a few measures, feeling the rhythm and harmony, before starting her own melodic line. What happened next surprised everyone in the room, including the musicians themselves. The two musical lines began intertwining naturally, like two voices singing in harmony. Emily crafted melodic phrases that perfectly complemented the professor's chords, while he gradually began adding variations and embellishments to his harmonic foundation. As the improvisation progressed, Professor Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years: pure musical joy. He wasn't thinking about technique, rules, or possible mistakes. He was simply communicating through music, reacting to what Emily played and responding with his own musical ideas. The students watched, mesmerized. It was like witnessing an intimate conversation between two people who had known each other for years, expressed entirely through musical notes. There were moments of tension and resolution, questions and answers, agreements and subtle disagreements, all conveyed without a single word. Emily, sensing the professor was growing more comfortable, began introducing more complex elements. She added rhythmic syncopations, tonal modulations, quotes from familiar melodies that the professor recognized and incorporated into his own playing. What had started as a simple demonstration was turning into something much greater. It was a musical reconciliation, a bridge being built between two musicians who had begun as adversaries and were discovering they could be collaborators. When the improvisation reached its natural end, the silence that followed was different from usual. It wasn't the awkward silence that typically followed performances in Professor Richard's class. It was the respectful silence that follows a truly moving performance. Then, slowly, the applause began. First one student, then another, until the entire room was clapping. But the most surprising thing was the expression on Professor Richard's face. Tears rolled down his cheeks, and he made no effort to hide them. "Professor," Emily said softly, "are you okay?" "I had forgotten," he murmured, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I had completely forgotten what it's like to play." "Real music? What do you mean?" "All these years I focused so much on teaching rules and techniques that I forgot why I fell in love with music in the first place," he explained, looking down at the guitar in his hands. "I forgot that music is about emotion, about connection, about communication between souls." Emily smiled and placed a hand on the professor's shoulder. "Then now you remember, and you can teach that to your students." Professor Richard looked at the class and saw something in the students' faces he had never seen before: genuine admiration. Not the forced respect that came from fear, but the respect born from inspiration. "Would anyone like to try?" he asked, his voice still a little unsteady. "Could we do a group improvisation?" Several hands shot up immediately. For the first time in the history of his classes, the students were eager to participate, to express themselves musically without fear of judgment. What followed was one of the most memorable lessons in the history of the Boston Municipal Conservatory of Music. Students who had never played together discovered musical affinities. Shy students found their artistic voices, and Professor Richard rediscovered his passion for teaching, but now based on inspiration rather than intimidation. When the class ended, the students left the room with a buzz of excitement that had never been there before. They talked about music differently, more animated, more personal. Professor Richard and Emily stayed behind, organizing the instruments and chairs. "Thank you," the professor said, breaking the silence. "For what?" "For reminding me of who I used to be, and for showing me who I can still become." Emily smiled and closed the guitar case. "You did the hard part. I just helped open the door." "And now," he asked, "where do we go from here?" "Now we really begin," she replied. "You have so much to teach, and I have so much to learn. But this time we'll do it together, as it should have been from the start." But the journey of reconciliation between Professor Richard and Emily was only beginning. The next day, when they arrived at the conservatory, they discovered their improvised performance had caused an unexpected stir. The conservatory's director, Professor Margaret Williams, a woman in her 60s known for her seriousness and academic rigor, was waiting for them in the faculty room. "Professor Blackwell, Miss Parker, we need to talk," she said, her formal tone making them both nervous. They followed her to her office, a small space crowded with music books, diplomas, and photographs of past conservatory classes. Professor Margaret sat behind her desk and studied them with an unreadable expression. "Yesterday I received several phone calls from students' parents," she began. "Their children came home talking about something extraordinary that happened. In guitar class, Professor Richard Blackwell and Emily Parker exchanged nervous glances. They didn't know if this was good or bad. Professor Williams," Professor Blackwell started, "if there are any complaints about unorthodox methods—" "Complaints?" she interrupted, and for the first time in years a smile appeared on her face. "Professor Blackwell, in 20 years running this conservatory, I've never seen students as excited about music as they were yesterday. Parents are asking if they can sit in on classes." The relief was visible on both their faces, but Professor Williams wasn't finished. "However," she continued, her tone growing more serious, "this has also brought up a delicate situation. The conservatory is undergoing an evaluation by the Department of Education. If we don't demonstrate academic excellence in the next 2 months, we could lose our accreditation." Emily's stomach tightened. Losing accreditation would mean she'd lose her scholarship, her only chance at formal music education. "What does this mean for us?" Professor Blackwell asked. "It means I need you to prepare a special presentation for the evaluators," Professor Williams explained. "Something that shows not just technical skill, but also teaching innovation. Are you up for the challenge?" Emily and Professor Blackwell exchanged glances. It was an incredible opportunity, but also a huge responsibility. The future of the conservatory might depend on their performance. "We accept," Emily said before the professor could hesitate. "Excellent," Professor Williams smiled. "You have 6 weeks to prepare. And Miss Parker?" "Yes, Professor?" "Congratulations on bringing out the best in Professor Blackwell again. I haven't seen him this inspired in years." When they left the director's office, Professor Blackwell was clearly nervous. "Emily, are you sure we can do this?" he asked. "The department evaluators are extremely strict. They expect technical perfection, traditional classical repertoire." "Hi, Professor," Emily interrupted. "Yesterday you said you'd forgotten what it was like to play real music. Do you want to go back to just teaching technique and rules?" "No, of course not, but then trust me. Let's show those evaluators that real music is worth more than empty technical perfection." Despite his nerves, Professor Blackwell felt a spark of excitement. It had been a long time since he'd felt positively challenged in his career. "All right," he agreed, "but we'll need a plan and a lot of work." "I have an idea," Emily said, her eyes shining. "What if we involve other students? We could create a performance that shows different skill levels working together." "A group performance?" The professor considered it. "It's risky. If one student makes a mistake, it could ruin the whole thing. Or it could show how real music works," Emily argued. "In real life, musicians support each other, cover for mistakes, create something greater than the sum of its parts. Isn't that what you should have been teaching all along?" The question struck him deeply. His entire career had focused on individual perfection, competition between students, fear of mistakes. But Emily was right. Real music was about collaboration, about community. "You're right," he admitted. "But will the other students even want to participate? After years of me intimidating them?" "We'll find out," Emily said. "But first, there's something I need to tell you." Her serious tone made him stop in the hallway. "What is it?" "If the conservatory loses accreditation, I lose my scholarship," she confessed. "My mother can't afford the tuition. This might be my last chance for a formal music education." Professor Richard Blackwell felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about his career or the future of the conservatory. It was about the dreams of a talented young woman who deserved every opportunity in the world. "That won't happen," he said with a determination that surprised them both. "We'll give the best performance these evaluators have ever seen. I promise." Over the following weeks, Professor Blackwell and Emily Parker worked tirelessly to prepare for the performance. They involved other students, created innovative musical arrangements that blended classical technique with elements of American folk music, and developed a narrative showcasing the evolution of musical learning. But not everything went smoothly. 3 weeks before the evaluation, they received troubling news. One of the evaluators would be Professor Jonathan Stevens, a notoriously conservative music critic and Professor Blackwell's former college classmate. "Jonathan always considered me a mediocre musician," Professor Blackwell confessed to Emily during rehearsal. "He has a very rigid view of what constitutes musical excellence." "What happened between you two?" Emily asked, noticing the tension in his voice. Professor Blackwell hesitated before answering. "We were classmates in college. Both of us dreamed of becoming professional concert musicians. Jonathan was always technically superior, more disciplined, more focused. When it came time to compete, for a spot in the State Symphony Orchestra he got it and I didn't. And that ended your friendship. Worse than that, Jonathan made sure to tell me I'd never be a real musician because I relied too much on emotion and not enough on pure technique. He said music wasn't about feelings. It was about precision and discipline." Emily immediately understood why this evaluation mattered so much. It wasn't just about the conservatory's future. It was about validating decades of Professor Blackwell's insecurities. "Professor," she said calmly, "do you still believe what he said?" "Sometimes," he admitted, "especially in recent years, when I became a bitter teacher instead of an accomplished musician." "Then this is our chance to prove him wrong," Emily declared, "to show that music is exactly about emotion and technique working together." "But what if we fail? What if he's right? Then at least we'll have tried to make real music," Emily replied, "and that's already a victory." In the days that followed, the tension at the conservatory was palpable. Everyone knew how crucial the upcoming evaluation was. Some faculty members began questioning whether Professor Blackwell and Emily's innovative approach was appropriate for such a high-stakes situation. Professor Robert Thompson, one of the conservatory's senior faculty, approached Professor Blackwell in the staff room. "Richard, are you sure about what you're doing?" he asked, his tone concerned. "The Department of Education evaluators expect a certain standard. Maybe it's best to return to traditional methods for this performance." "Robert, for 20 years I used traditional methods and never inspired a single soul," Professor Blackwell replied. "Finally, I've found something that works. I'm not giving up now." "But what if it backfires? The entire conservatory could pay the price." The pressure mounted. Other professors voiced similar concerns. Even some parents called, questioning whether the experimental approach was suitable for such an important occasion. A week before the evaluation, Professor Margaret Williams called an emergency meeting with Professor Blackwell and Emily. "We've received some concerns about your performance," she said, clearly uncomfortable. "Some members of the school board are suggesting we should perhaps take a more conservative approach." Emily Parker's heart sank. After weeks of intense preparation, everything could be cancelled at the last minute. "Professor Williams," said Professor Richard Blackwell, "I know it's risky, but for the first time in decades, I'm certain I'm doing the right thing. This performance represents everything I believe about music and education. And I fully support Professor Blackwell," Emily added. "If we're going to fail, let it be by trying to do something true, not by pretending to be something we're not." Professor Williams studied them for a long moment before sighing deeply. "All right, you have my support. But understand this, if this goes wrong, we'll all pay the price." The night before the evaluation, Emily came home exhausted but determined. Susan Parker found her in the kitchen, sipping tea to calm her nerves. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Susan asked, sitting beside her. "Scared," Emily admitted, "but also excited. Tomorrow we'll show the world what real music can do. And if it doesn't work out, then at least we tried, and we'll learn that sometimes trying is more important than succeeding." Susan smiled and kissed her daughter's forehead. Your father would be proud, she murmured. Wherever he is, I know he's rooting for you. On the morning of the evaluation, the conservatory was buzzing. The evaluators arrived early, 3 elegantly dressed individuals carrying clipboards and stern expressions. Professor Jonathan Stevens was exactly as Professor Blackwell remembered, tall, lean, with an air of superiority that was almost palpable. "Richard," Jonathan greeted coldly when the evaluators were introduced to the faculty. "Still trying to be a musician?" The jab hit the professor like a punch to the gut, but he forced himself to stay composed. "Still teaching music," he replied. "And still learning too." "We'll see," Jonathan said, making a note on his clipboard. The performance was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. That morning, Professor Blackwell and Emily held one last rehearsal with the other students involved. There were 6 in total, representing different skill levels and ages, ranging from 15 to 20. "Remember," Professor Blackwell said before they began, "don't focus on perfection. Focus on communicating. The music we're making today is about telling a story together." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. When it was time for the performance, the auditorium was packed. Besides the evaluators, there were parents, teachers, conservatory staff, and even some students from other schools who had heard about the special presentation. Professor Jonathan Stevens sat in the front row, his expression skeptical, arms crossed. His fellow evaluators seemed equally doubtful, frequently checking their clipboards and watches. Professor Blackwell stepped onto the stage, his guitar in trembling hands. Behind him, Emily and the other 5 students took their places. With their instruments, 2 guitars, a violin, a flute, and a small percussion set. "Good afternoon," Professor Blackwell began, his voice slightly unsteady. "Today's performance isn't just about demonstrating technical skill. It's about showing how music can be a universal language of communication, collaboration, and personal growth." Jonathan rolled his eyes visibly, jotting down a negative note on his clipboard. "Our piece today," the professor continued, "is a musical journey that represents the learning process. We began with the simplicity of discovery, moved through the complexity of development, and ended with the synthesis of artistic maturity." He signaled to the students, and the music began. The first section was performed by Emily alone, playing a simple, sweet melody that represented the innocence of musical discovery. Her notes were clear and direct, unadorned, like a child speaking their first words. Gradually, Professor Richard Blackwell joined her, adding a basic harmony that supported and enriched the melody. The music grew organically, like a conversation between teacher and student. Jonathan watched with increasing attention, though his expression remained skeptical. The technique was solid, but he was waiting for something more complex to impress him. In the second section, the other students began joining one by one. First the violin, then the flute, then the percussion, each adding their own voice to the E. Musical conversation. But it wasn't just addition, it was integration. Each new instrument responded to what had been played before, creating a rich, nuanced musical dialogue. It was at this moment that Jonathan began leaning forward in his chair. He recognized something in the structure of the performance that he hadn't expected. Real pedagogical sophistication. This wasn't just a group playing together. It was a demonstration of how different skill levels could collaborate to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The third section introduced elements of improvisation. Each musician had moments to express themselves individually, yet always within the context of the group. Emily shone in this section, her refined technique and mature musicality, beautifully contrasting with the simpler but equally valid contributions of the other students. Professor Richard watched Jonathan during this part and saw something unexpected. The evaluator was truly listening, not just analyzing. His posture had shifted from skeptical to curious. The final section was the riskiest. They had planned a conclusion incorporating elements of American folk music, blues, jazz, and bluegrass, woven together with classical technique. It was exactly the kind of fusion Jonathan traditionally dismissed. But as the music unfolded, something magical happened. The blend of styles didn't sound forced or artificial. It sounded natural, organic, as if it were the inevitable evolution of the musical journey they had begun with Emily's simple melody. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was deep and respectful. Then, slowly, the applause began. First from the audience of parents and students, then from the teachers, and finally, to everyone's surprise, from Jonathan Stevens himself. After the performance, the evaluators withdrew to deliberate. Professor Richard and Emily remained, on stage, exhausted but satisfied. "I think we did it," Emily murmured. "Regardless of the outcome," the professor replied, "we made real music, and that's what matters." 20 minutes later, the evaluators returned. Jonathan stood to speak, his expression inscrutable. "In 30 years of evaluating music institutions," he began, "I've rarely seen such a clear demonstration of pedagogical excellence combined with thoughtful artistic innovation." Professor Richard nearly fainted. Jonathan was praising his approach. Today's performance showed not just technical competence, but a deep understanding of the fundamental principles of music education: progressive development, collaboration, practical application of theory, and most importantly, nurturing genuine musical passion. Jonathan paused, looking directly at Professor Richard. "Richard, you've discovered something it took me decades to learn. Technique without soul is just exercise, but technique with soul, that is real music." The words hit Professor Richard Blackwell like an absolution for decades of insecurity. His former colleague, the harshest critic he knew, was validating not just his performance, but his entire musical philosophy. The Boston Municipal Conservatory of Music not only maintains its accreditation, Marcus continued, but receives our recommendation as a model of pedagogical innovation for other institutions. The explosion of joy in the auditorium was instantaneous. Parents, students, and teachers rose in applause, hugs, and tears of relief and happiness. Emily Parker felt her legs go weak. She had kept her scholarship. The conservatory was saved, but more importantly, she had been part of something truly special. Professor Blackwell approached Marcus after the official ceremony. "Marcus, I don't know what to say." "Say you forgive me for being an arrogant fool in college," Marcus replied, extending his hand. "It took me a long time to realize I was wrong about almost everything." "What do you mean?" "I spent decades chasing technical perfection and completely forgot why I fell in love with music in the first place. Today, watching your performance, I remembered, and it reminded me that being a musician isn't about being perfect. It's about being human." The two men embraced, closing a circle of resentment that had lasted over 30 years. After everyone had left, Emily and Professor Blackwell remained alone in the auditorium, putting away the instruments. "Professor," Emily said, "can I confess something?" "Of course." "On the first day of class, when you humiliated me in front of everyone, I almost quit. I went home and told my mother I wanted to leave the conservatory." Professor Blackwell stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "What made you change your mind?" "My mother told me something I've never forgotten. Sweetheart, people only try to destroy what they fear. If he's trying to break you, it's because he sees something in you that scares him." That's when I realized you didn't hate me. You were afraid of me. "Afraid of you?" "Afraid of what I represented. Afraid that I might achieve what you never could, to be truly free in music." Professor Blackwell felt his eyes well up. Emily's insight was devastatingly accurate. "You were right," he admitted. "I was afraid that you were everything I could never be." "But you discovered something important," Emily said. "You realized you don't have to be me. You just have to be the best Professor Blackwell you can be, and today you were exactly that." "And you?" he asked. "Will you continue your studies here?" "I will," Emily smiled, "but now as your partner, not your adversary." "Partner?" "Professor Margaret Williams offered me a teaching assistant position. I'll help you develop this new methodology and apply it with other students." Professor Blackwell felt a wave of pride and gratitude. The young woman he had once tried to destroy had become not just his professional salvation, but his personal inspiration. "We have a lot of work ahead," he said. "Yes," Emily agreed. "But for the first time, I'm truly excited to begin." In the months that followed, The Boston Municipal Conservatory of Music was completely transformed. The collaborative methodology developed by Professor Blackwell and Emily spread across all disciplines. Students who had once been shy and insecure began to flourish artistically. The waiting list for enrollment grew exponentially, but perhaps the most significant change was in Professor Blackwell himself. He rediscovered his passion not just for music, but for teaching. His classes became events students eagerly anticipated, knowing each session would be a new musical adventure. Emily, in turn, found in her role as a teaching assistant a way to develop not only her musical skills, but also her leadership and mentoring abilities. She discovered that teaching music was almost as rewarding as playing it. 1 year after the evaluation, the conservatory received a special visit. Michael Parker, Emily's father who had disappeared 9 years earlier, appeared at the school's door. Emily was leaving a class when she spotted a familiar man waiting in the hallway. For a moment, she couldn't process what she was seeing. Then, reality hit her like a bolt of lightning. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael looked older, thinner, with graying hair that hadn't been there 9 years before. His clothes were simple but clean, and he held a small bouquet of flowers in his trembling hands. "Hi, Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. You've grown so much. What are you doing here?" she asked, still in shock. "I heard about your performance, about how you've become an amazing musician. I needed to see for myself." "You abandoned me," Emily said, the pain of 9 years seeping into her voice. "You left my guitar and disappeared without a word." "I know," Michael lowered his eyes, "and there's no excuse for that. But I can explain, if you'll give me a chance." Emily stared at the father she hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Part of her wanted to run, part wanted to scream, and a small part, the part that was still the 8-year-old girl who loved her dad, wanted to hug him. "5 minutes," she finally said, "and only because we're at school." Michael nodded, and they walked to a bench in the conservatory's courtyard. He sat at a respectful distance, as if knowing he had no right to closeness. "When I left you that guitar," he began, "I was completely lost. Your mother and I, things were hard. I couldn't find work, the bills were piling up, and I felt like a complete failure as a man, as a husband, as a father." "That doesn't justify abandoning your family," Emily said, her voice cold. "No, it doesn't," Michael agreed. "But in my confused mind, I thought you'd be better off without me. I thought I was just a burden, an obstacle to your happiness." "You were wrong." "I was. And it took me 9 years to realize just how wrong I was." Michael took a deep breath before continuing. "After I left, I tried to rebuild my life in Chicago. I got a few jobs, but I could never focus. I always thought about you, especially about you playing that guitar. For years, I convinced myself you'd forgotten me, that you were better off without me." "We never forgot you," Emily murmured, despite her anger. "Mom never spoke badly about you, not even when she struggled to pay the bills alone." "Your mother was always a better person than me," Michael said, his eyes welling up. "When I finally found the courage to come back to Boston to try to make amends, I found out you'd moved. It took me months to track you down. And when you did, I watched from a distance. I saw your mother work hard, saw you grow into an incredible young woman, and I realized it might be too late to be part of your lives." "So what changed?" "I overheard a neighbor talking about your performance at the conservatory, about how you saved the school with your talent, about how you'd become an extraordinary musician, and I realized the guitar I left you wasn't in vain. You managed to do with music everything I never could with my life." Emily felt tears burning her eyes but refused to let them fall. "You can't just show up after 9 years and expect everything to go back to normal," she said. "I know," Michael nodded. "I'm not asking for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it. I'm not asking to come back because I know that right no longer exists. I just wanted you to know that all these years, even from afar, I was proud of you. And I wanted to give you something." He pulled an envelope from his pocket and handed it to Emily. "What is this?" "All the money I managed to save over these 9 years. It's not much, but it's enough to pay for a few semesters of private lessons with instructors if you'd like. or to buy a better guitar, or for anything that helps your music career. Emily looked at the envelope without taking it. I don't want your money. Then what do you want? I want you to explain this to my mother. I want you to apologize to her, not to me. I was a child. I moved on. But she was the one left with the responsibility of raising me alone, of working 3 jobs to keep me in school. Michael nodded, understanding the fairness of her demand. And after that? After that, maybe we can talk about you getting to know the person I've become. Not as your right as a father, but as something I choose to give you, if I choose to. It's more than I deserve, Michael said. Much more, Emily agreed, standing up from the bench. But it's not about what you deserve. It's about what I can live with in peace. That night, Emily told Susan everything. Her mother listened in silence, her expression shifting through a range of emotions: surprise, anger, sadness, and finally, weary resignation. He wants to talk to you, Emily said, to apologize. And do you think I should? I think you should. Do what brings you peace, Mom. You carried this weight alone for 9 years. Maybe it's time to set it down. And you? How do you feel about all this? Emily thought for a long moment. Confused, angry, but also relieved. All these years, I wondered if he was alive, if he was okay, if he ever thought about us. Now I know. And even though I don't forgive what he did, at least I don't have to wonder anymore. The next day, Susan agreed to meet Michael. They met at the same cafe they used to go to when they were dating 20 years earlier. The conversation was difficult, full of tears and accusations, but also necessary closure. Michael explained his reasons, took full responsibility for his choices, and asked for forgiveness, knowing he might never receive it. Susan, in turn, expressed all the pain and frustration she had carried, but also acknowledged that holding on to bitterness was hurting her more than him. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, she said at the end, but I can try to let the anger go. It's more than I deserve, Michael replied. Yes, it is. But this isn't about you. It's about me and our daughter finding peace. In the months that followed, Michael gradually and carefully became part of Emily and Susan's lives again. Not as a husband or father, roles he had forfeited, but as someone who genuinely wanted to make amends. He began attending Emily's performances at the conservatory, always sitting in the back, never intruding, just watching with quiet pride the extraordinary young woman his daughter had become. Emily, for her part, found that her father's presence didn't diminish what she had achieved on her own. In fact, in a way, having overcome his abandonment and succeeded despite it, made her victories even more meaningful. 2 years after the evaluation that saved the conservatory, Emily graduated with honors and received a full scholarship to study at the New England Conservatory of Music. It was the next step in her musical journey. At the graduation ceremony, she took the stage to deliver the valedictorian speech. The auditorium was packed with family, professors, and classmates. In the front row sat Susan, Michael, and Professor Richard Blackwell, all with tears in their eyes. When I first came to the conservatory 4 years ago, Emily began, I thought I was here just to learn musical technique. I didn't know I'd also learn about forgiveness, about courage, about turning adversity into strength. She looked directly at Professor Blackwell. I learned that sometimes our greatest teachers are the ones who challenge us the hardest. That real growth comes from conflict, not comfort. And that true excellence isn't about individual perfection, but our ability to lift each other up. After the ceremony, Professor Blackwell approached Emily for a private farewell. You saved my career, he said. More than that, you saved my soul as an educator. Professor, you saved yourself. I just helped show the way. And now, where do you go from here? I'll study composition at the university. I want to write music that tells stories like ours. Music that shows how different people can come together to create something beautiful. And after university? Emily smiled and looked around the conservatory that had become her second home. Who knows? Maybe I'll come back here. Maybe it'll be my turn to teach, to help other young people find their musical voice. This place will always have a chair waiting for you, said Professor Blackwell, and I'll always be grateful for everything I learned here, Emily replied. 5 years. Later, Emily did return to the Boston Municipal Conservatory of Music, but not as a student. She came back as a professor, bringing with her a master's degree in composition and a teaching approach even more refined, blending everything she'd learned from Professor Blackwell with her own academic discoveries. Her first class included a 16-year-old named Sarah, who arrived at the conservatory with a defensive attitude and raw talent that reminded Emily so much of herself years before. "Professor," Sarah asked after the first lesson, "is it true that you and Professor Blackwell used to be enemies?" Emily smiled, remembering what it was like to be young and curious about the adults around her. "Not exactly enemies," she replied, "more like two people who needed to learn how to understand each other. Sometimes the best partnerships start with the worst misunderstandings. And now you're friends? We're colleagues, partners in music education, and two people who learned it's possible to grow from conflict rather than be destroyed by it." Sarah seemed to consider this for a moment. "Professor, can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course." "Do you still feel angry about everything that happened in the beginning?" Emily thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes I feel an echo of that anger, but I've learned something important. Anger held on to becomes poison. Anger transformed becomes strength. The choice is ours." "How did you turn your anger into strength?" "By using it as fuel to become the best musician and teacher I could be. Every time someone doubted me, I used that doubt as motivation to prove them wrong. Every obstacle became a stepping stone." Sarah nodded, absorbing the lesson. "And Professor Blackwell, did he really change?" "Completely," Emily replied. "He discovered that being a great teacher isn't about intimidating students or proving superiority. It's about inspiring growth, nurturing talent, and creating safe spaces for people to become the best version of themselves." "Do you think I can change too?" Sarah asked, vulnerability creeping into her voice. "Sarah, you don't need to change who you are. You need to discover who you can become, and I'll be here to help you on that journey, just like Professor Blackwell helped me on mine." End of the story. Now tell us what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave your sincere thoughts in the comments. Do you think Emily made the right decision by forgiving and working with Professor Richard? We'd love to hear your opinion. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to like the video, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heartwarming stories.